And we have discussed this with the city council. The city council also wants to be proactive, to make sure that the needs of water needs for our community are met. And I've had discussions with several people throughout the community, and we have beautiful landscapes, beautiful yards here in the city. There's a lot of value that is in these yards. There's a lot of resources and funds that have been put into our landscapes and our yards. And it's the intention of the city to provide adequately for the pressurized irrigation needs to maintain these yards. Our pressurized irrigation system and the culinary water system are two separate systems. And they operate differently, and yet they are tied together through a couple of our sources, mainly our wells. And so our water resources are they are separated in system operations, but they're combined when we talk total water resources. And there is a difference between system performance, how the pumps and the pipes and the wells perform on a daily basis, and water rights, aquifers, things like that are kind of two separate topics. But tonight we want to focus on the water system itself, the pumps, the piping, the supply system, and how we can manage that and manage our water resources so that we have water supply going from here forward and throughout build-out. We're really close to build-out. The city has looked at different scenarios based on the zoning maps. We are 80 to 90% built out, and so there's not a lot of growth left in the city, but even though there's not substantial areas to develop, additional demand will be had on the system, on the pressurized irrigation system. And if we're already running at capacity, how do we handle additional growth? That's a question that, definitely as a staff and council, we've been trying to make sure that we get a handle on. And with that, the city council authorized a study to be completed by Hansen, and Luce to look at the water system, the pressurized irrigation system, and to generate a model, a water model for that. The city did not have a complete water model for the pressurized irrigation system prior to Hansen, and Luce coming on board and completing that study. And then in addition to that, we wanted to have them analyze different scenarios. So they have looked at about 6 different scenarios, including our current conditions, if we were to conserve and if we continue on the path that we are, both with our current population and then build out. And then also a scenario where we have possibly an issue with some of our supply systems, so say a well or a pump system that malfunctions, doesn't operate properly. And those systems are mechanical. They will break down, they will have an issue at some point. Our intention is to maintain them the best we can and have as many backup parts as we can for those systems. And so, but that is part of this analysis, is to look at what happens in those scenarios if we don't have a fully functioning system. And so we will go through a presentation that Richard Noble will give to us there. Before we start that, Paul, do you have any comments? Do you have anything you want to say?
Well, I think you've covered the issue pretty closely with what we saw. And basically, when you build a system, you want to have some redundancy so that if you have a part of it goes down, you can still deliver what is needed. And when Cedar Hill City drilled the last well, they felt they had that redundancy, but could be consuming water right up to the max at times. And if there was something to happen, then we would not be able to deliver the water that's required. So part of the duty of the water, what you call it? Water Conservation Committee was to come up with some recommendations to the council, to the city administration on possible ways that we can approach this to develop some redundancy within the existing system and to be able to provide the services that the citizens of Cedar Hills look forward to and we've been able to deliver in the past. So that's what we were doing.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to start then with your presentation?
Well, thank you. Is this on? Okay. Doesn't sound like it. That's good. So my name is Richard Noble. I'm a principal with Hansen and Luce Engineers. And as David mentioned, we were retained to perform an evaluation of the city's pressurized irrigation system. I also happen to be a resident of Cedar Hills, so I have a little bit of a vested interest here as well. David already gave us much of this background, but I'll just go through this again. The city is approximately 90% built out. There's not a lot of room for additional growth. Last year, the water use in Cedar Hills with the PI system was very high, and the system was maxed out during much of the summer at or even a little bit above the design capacity. And so the city's concerned that with the long-term operation of the system, can it be sustained at these very high levels, or really the feeling is that this will cause system components to start to fail, and that's a concern. And then with the addition of new homes coming into the city, that would only add to the problem. And so those are the issues that this study deals with. I want to give you just a little bit of understanding of what the pressurized irrigation system is and what the key components are. The system consists of several things. A lot of pipes in the ground. There's also water sources, and I'll go over those in just a minute, and storage reservoirs and pumps. As far as where the water comes from for the PI system, there are several sources. There's a connection to the Central Utah Project's Alpine Aqueduct Reach 3, right adjacent to the Murdoch Canal. And you may or may not be aware, but in the Murdoch Canal alignment, besides the new big pipe that the canal's in, there are two other major aqueducts in that same alignment. And those two other pipelines are for the Central Utah Project. And so Cedar Hills has a turnout dedicated to the city at this location that can deliver CUP water to that location. And then over on the north side of the city, there's another CUP connection because there's another pipeline that connects onto this aqueduct and runs down the Timpanogos Highway and up near the debris basin at the mouth of American Fork Canyon. And so Cedar Hills has another connection at that location. The city also receives a limited amount of water from the Pleasant Grove Ditch, which comes out of American Fork Canyon. But that water supply, it's great during the snowmelt runoff, but it tapers off during the summer, as we all know. The city also drilled an irrigation well down by the lower portion of the golf course, and that well is dedicated exclusively for the pressurized irrigation system. And then the Cottonwood well, which was drilled just a few years ago, is kind of a dual purpose well. It can deliver water to the drinking water system, or it can be switched over and deliver water to the PI system. But it can't do both at the same time because it would be an illegal connection to have it connected to both systems at the same time. Then as far as storage facilities go, there are several ponds in the golf course. Pond number 10 is adjacent to, kind of between holes 9 and 10 on the golf course, and that's where it gets its name as pond number 10. And then pond number 12 is up on the bench, adjacent to fairway number 12. And then pond 17 is near hole 17, amazingly, and pond 18 by hole 8. Then there's a storage tank up on the hill that serves the upper pressure zone. I'll talk about pressure zones in just a moment. There are also several booster pumps in the system. There are booster pumps, 5 booster pumps located adjacent to pond number 10 that can pump water from pond 10 up to pond 12. Then there are booster pumps, 6 booster pumps adjacent to pond 12 that can pump into this upper tank here. There's also a booster pump down on Harvey Boulevard by Old Orchard Estates. Deerfield Elementary is located right here. And so these are the main components of the pressurized irrigation system. But I do want to mention one other facility, and that's the Harvey well. The Harvey well is not directly a component of the pressurized irrigation system. It is plumbed only into the drinking water system. However, if the Harvey well should experience difficulties, if we burn up a motor, or the pump has problems, or the well itself does, then the Cottonwood well would have to be switched over and provide water to the drinking water system, and so it would not be available to the PI system. Now, I mentioned that the system is separated into 3 zones. That's because of the wide elevation difference throughout the city. And so there's an upper zone, which is this darker shaded area, and then a middle zone, which is this lighter green shaded area, and then the lower zone here. And the reason for that is if we just had one zone, in order to provide enough pressure for this area up here, the pressures would be so high down here, probably have 300 psi, and we'd be blowing everybody's sprinkler systems apart. It just doesn't work. And so these systems are separated by closed valves or pressure reducing valves. Now, the scope of what Hansen, Luce was hired to do was to evaluate the capacity and the performance of the PI system. And so in order to do this, we created a computer model of the system. And then we were asked to evaluate the PI system under several different conditions. One was based on the water demands that we saw last year, the high water use. And then another condition was based on implementing water conservation measures and backing off the demands to something that we believe is a more appropriate level. And with the reduced water demands, there are really 2 scenarios we looked at. One with the existing level of development, and then also with the city and build-out conditions. In other words, all the developable areas with homes in them. And then we, as David mentioned, we also evaluated system operation with failure of key system components. I want to talk about water usage for a moment. This graph is intended to compare the actual water usage from last year with what we believe is a more appropriate water usage. And so the dark bars represent the actual water usage from 2013. And the light bars are based on what the state recommends that we use with appropriate efficiency factors applied as well. And so you can see during August of 2013, there were over 180 million gallons of water delivered through the PI system. That's a lot of water. and that is equivalent to a daily demand of 10 gallons per minute per acre on a continuous basis. A more appropriate peak demand should be around 6 gallons per minute per acre, and we evaluate a lot of water systems throughout the state, and 6 gallons per minute per acre is about what we see in other systems up and down the Wasatch Front that have metered water systems where the residents are being careful with the amount of water that they use. And so, excuse me, yes.
For other cities that are not metered, are we in the ballpark with them? Are they also up at 10 and having issues like we are?
The answer to that is it kind of varies, but overall I would say yes.
So is anybody else looking at metering, or are we ahead of the curve there?
The other cities are looking at it, and other water districts as well, and including the Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District, which is probably the oldest pressurized irrigation system on a large scale throughout the state. I grew up in Davis County, and we had what we called Weaver Water when I was a young boy, and that was in the late 1950s. And so they're now seeing the need for metered connections as well. And probably the biggest culprit is our convenient automatic water timers. It's easy to set those and then not worry about them. Back 30 years ago, when you had to turn a valve or pull out a hose to water your lawn, people were a lot more judicious with how they applied water. But I'm getting a little bit off track here, and so I wanted to stick with our evaluation. So, but I think these this is a reasonable number, the 6 gallons per minute per acre, as far as where we ought to be. Now that 6 gallons per minute per acre demand does not occur uniformly throughout the day. And so in our model, we developed a daily demand curve, and it shows at 9 p.m. people starting to water, and the water use ramps up until it reaches a peak at about 4 a.m. and 4 through 6 a.m. It's kind of going full bore, and then it starts to taper off right after 8 o'clock. I think this is a pretty typical pattern of what you would see here in Cedar Hills as far as water use. So I want to show you the results of our modeling and give you kind of a visual impression of what's going on in the system. This is the computer model we created. This is a screenshot from the model output. And so it contains all the information about the pipes, the pumps, the sources, the wells, the reservoirs. It's all modeled in there. There are operating rules that tell the model when to turn a pump on, when to turn it off, all of those things. And so I want to show you what happens during this daily demand cycle. The color of the pipes shown on here represents the amount of water flowing through the pipes. And so you can see over here on the left-hand side the scale with the blue colors being low flow and then ramping up to the warmer colors where red is a high flow in a pipe. Over here, you can see as the model steps through the time of day, and we're going to go through a cycle of 3 days just so you can kind of see what's going on with the system in terms of the water delivery. Okay, so here we are about 4 in the afternoon. Let's stop. it's saying 3 o'clock, but it's not advanced.
Maybe you just put it out your desk.
We have to do that. So much for trying to be fancy.
Should have.
Okay, here it's going. So you can see the pipes turning red with, no, it's just not going to cooperate. Sorry about that. Now, here we are in the evening, nighttime, and a lot of red, a lot of water going through, and then during the day, it shuts back off. And then we're coming up, here's 9 p.m. again, comes back on, the high demand. And in the morning, it shuts off again. One more day, we'll go through here. At 9 p.m. So anyway, kind of get a feel for how we have these daily cycles where a lot of water going through the system in the nighttime, and then it shuts off in the daytime. But maybe you also noticed that there are some pipes that stay red all the time, and those are the pipes from the sources that are delivering water from, say, a booster pump, pumping from the lower pond to the upper pond, or the well pumping into the system. And so those are pretty much going around the clock.
And this is assuming that water usage is spread out fairly evenly among the city, so we don't have
Correct.
any better data than that.
We don't have any way to distribute that other than uniformly throughout the city. And it's probably not a bad assumption. Then I'm going to show you a similar screenshot, except instead of showing the amount of flow in the pipe, we're going to see a little dot for each house, and the color of the dot represents how much pressure that is in the system. And so red is high pressure, and blue is low pressure in the range.
What do you consider high pressure?
Well, there's the scale right there, so 100 PSI. Here we're coming up on 9 o'clock, and you see the pressure just starting to drop throughout the system. And some very low pressure areas in certain places. It's going to go through a couple of days here.
So I built my house in my place. Always got low pressure.
So here we go, another day, and the pressures drop again with the high usage. And then it goes back up. I'm going to watch this area here. This whole area gets kind of low here in this area right here.
It seemed like the forest would be this out of the city.
So it's going to turn to blue there, and then this area right here.
Benches along the Lincoln Heights.
So that's just kind of a gee whiz thing, I guess, to show you what the model does. But it actually goes through and evaluates the system on an hourly basis based on the distribution of those demands. Now I'm going to show you what happens if we were to implement water conservation over that 6 gallons per minute per acre. So the only thing that's changed is the demand. So you'll see that the pressures don't get quite as low. The extent of those blue and green areas is much smaller under this. So we're coming up again. Here's 9 p.m. And it cycles through.
So what's yellow?
Yellow is 75 to 100 psi.
What would be normal?
What would be normal?
That's about where the city would
I would
like.
like to have between 50 and 75 PSI at my house. You get above that, and then you have problems with misting. You get below that, and you have problems getting even distribution.
Well, I've got a pressure regulator in my system that needs a holding down to 40.
That
But
was
I
my
system
system.
for 40.
Is even if we're running 100 PSI to our house, a lot of us still have PRVs in our systems that are bringing it down to 60 or 50.
And that'd be the best thing to do.
So is there a downside to maintaining a higher pressure if residents have PRVs?
Well,
The downside for high pressure on your pressurized irrigation is if there's ever a crossing, if there's ever a time where your pressurized irrigation gets hooked up to the culinary, and your pressurized irrigation is at a higher pressure than your culinary system, it'll push bad water into the culinary system. So as a general rule, as a policy, the city tries to have the culinary pressure higher than the pressurized irrigation pressure, so that it will force culinary water into the PI system versus the other way around.
there are other issues as well. For example, with higher pressures, the likelihood of leaks is increased, and the amount of water leaking out of the system is increased. Also, with higher pressures, if you're having to pump water into the system, which Cedar Hills does, then it takes more energy to do that as well.
But some of that has to do with elevation drop.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, this next scenario is similar to the last one, only with build-out conditions. We added a big demand right here to provide for future development of homes in this area. And you'll see that it operates about the same as the last scenario that we just looked at. There's very little difference, just minor differences in pressure.
50 GPM.
Yes, that's with conservation. All right, well, enough of that. Now let's go back to the PowerPoint. So now I want to show you a comparison of pressure fluctuations that we're seeing in selected areas throughout the city. So Tupanongas Cove is a trouble spot because of its high elevation. And so with last year's demands, they're just wide pressure swings. About all they can get static is about 40 psi pressure, and it drops down to almost nothing during the high demand period. With conservation, with the demand reduced, that levels out, and you actually get to a more manageable range where the swings are only about 15 psi. Still not great, but much better.
So does this mean we could gain a lot, even though it's not good to be watering during the daytime, if we told residents to spread out or throughout the day?
Well, I didn't say that. You know, as far as the peak demand on the pipelines, yes. But there are other issues that then come into play, because then you have increased evaporation, you're less efficient, so you're going to use more water overall. So it's kind of a two-edged sword there. Another location is on Wedgewood Drive, just off of Cedar Hills Drive, and so with the 2013 scenario, again, you see these pressure fluctuations with conservation and the reduced demand that levels right out quite nicely. Here on 10280 North, right at the intersection with Cottonwood, again, you have these pressure fluctuations with conservation. Those are diminished substantially. And then down on Dorchester Drive, adjacent to the Harvey Well by the Heritage Park, PSI swing in pressure with these high demands, and then with conservation, that levels out significantly. So that's kind of what we've learned as far as the difference between 2013 or even this year's demands, which are fairly similar, versus if we were to implement water conservation. Now I want to just kind of recap then the results of our analysis. So the scenario 1 is basically existing conditions with 2013 water demands. And so we had a very high water demand of about 5.9 million gallons per day. As I pointed out, there's inadequate pressure up on Tucanoga's Cove. There's marginal pressure near the top of the middle and the lower zones. Some of the pipes, and this is the reason for the high pressure swing, some of the pipes have very high velocities, just a lot of water ripping through those pipes. And this creates a lot of pressure loss when you have a high velocity. It also wears out the pipe. So it's not good either way. And so I already mentioned the high pressure fluctuations. Also, because of the pressure situation, the system has a hard time receiving water from that CUP South turnout. And so with the high pressure, there's not enough pressure in the aqueduct to get the water into the system. As the demand comes online and the pressures drop, then we're able to get water in. And so that's the reason for the Harvey booster pump. Unfortunately, because of requirements the Central Utah District put on the city, that pump is not located in an optimal location because it's got homes upstream from the booster pump and homes downstream. And so the homes downstream, when the pump comes on, it's great because it stabilizes the pressure. But what it does for the homes upstream from the pump, there they see big pressure drops and actually greater pressure fluctuations. And so it's kind of a not good situation. As far as scenario 2, that's our current level of development, but with water conservation in place. And so if the city were to achieve this more reasonable water use in that demand curve that I showed you, then the demand would be reduced to about 3.5 million gallons per day. And as I showed you also, the system pressures are significantly improved. The pipe velocities are improved. However, there are some pipes that are still kind of marginal, maybe a little undersized or overtaxed, but they could get by. And then also the pressures are much more stable, less fluctuation, and I already mentioned the need to, with that booster pump at Harvey Boulevard, ideally it should be located right by the turnout, and Central Utah has submissions with that.
For those trouble spots that would remain, what's the answer there? Take them straight and put in a bigger pipe, or how do you deal with those issues?
You know, my recommendation would be, if we get the demand where it needs to be, is to just keep operating. And then as the city experiences problems and you know, if there is a section of pipe that starts to leak and needs to be replaced, then when it's replaced, it could be upsized. But to tear up the streets now, probably, I wouldn't recommend. And then scenario 3 is the build-out condition, but with water conservation in place. And so the water usage with conservation would be about 3.8 million gallons per day. The system would behave about the same as scenario 2. And I think that the big point that I want to emphasize, and I think was really the purpose of this study, is that with water conservation, the system appears to have adequate capacity for build-out conditions. And so I'm not seeing anything that would indicate that we need to put in more pumps or enlarge facilities or anything like that. If we can just back off the water use, we should be just fine. And I think that's the big takeaway from this study. Yes.
If you were
were to simulate a scenario 4, where it's status quo, no conservation, but then we get build out.
Well, it's gonna be worse than scenario 1, yeah, a little bit, because we're 90% built out almost, we're just adding 10% more demand. So it'd be a little bit worse, maybe not significantly. Scenario 4 that I evaluated was with a well failure. And this could be failure of the Cottonwood well, which pumps directly into the PI system, or it could be failure of the Harvey well, in which case Cottonwood would need to be switched over and used on the drinking water system. So either way. And so there would be some workaround to keep the system operating, but it really wouldn't be good on a long-term basis. We could increase deliveries from the CUP North turnout and deliver water through the booster pumps up from pond 12 into pond 17. That's going to put a bigger load not only on the booster pumps, but the discharge pipe from those booster pumps. Then we start to see very high velocities if we don't conserve water. The maximum velocity we would want to see in that pipe would be about 7 feet per second. And without conservation, it would go up to 9, which is just not doable. And so the city would be forced to do something to bring the demand off. Also, another issue is the city only has a limited contract amount of CUP water available, 710 acre feet, and so can't use that at the full 7.5 cubic feet per second throughout the summer. That would far exceed the amount of water the city's contracted for, and the district wouldn't allow it. And so for a short term, might be able to get by, but long term, going to have to back off the demand if the well goes down. And then we looked at 2 other scenarios with a booster pump failure at pond 10 and a booster pump failure at pond 12. And really what we saw is that there appears to be enough redundancy in the booster pumps that those can get by. But what happens then is rather than being able to cycle off and rest, then they're just going full bore, and the likelihood of having another booster pump fail will be increased. And so there again, the recommendation would be if a booster pump goes down, then the city would have to take immediate action to reduce the demand on the system. Unless we were already being good with conservation, and then I think we would get by this time. So that's pretty much the results of our study. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
You mentioned that water conservation measures are the key to this. And you see to Utah, it's mostly leaning towards voluntary hourly to daily restrictions. Do those tend to work?
Well, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we were asked to do, but I can share my observations with what I've seen in other communities. I know the state of Utah did some studies with pressurized irrigation systems as the state was developing a state water conservation plan. What they saw with some of these voluntary programs, or even not voluntary, but maybe assigned days a week watering or something like that, is the state saw that there was actually an increase in the amount of water consumed, probably for a couple of reasons. One, you're worried that, there might be a hot day coming, and so I need to kind of prepare for that, make sure I get my lawn water well. Or you get a rainstorm that maybe wasn't enough to carry you by for 3 days, or 2 days, or whatever it might be, and so you go ahead and water anyway, whereas without those restrictions, you'd say, okay, I'll put the rain delay on my timer for a day and skip a day, and so you lose the benefit of those rainstorms. And then there also, for whatever reason, seems to be kind of a hoarding mentality. When you put restrictions on how much water people can take, and when it's available to them, they take a lot. And so you can still overwater if you're on an every other day watering regime or every 3 days. It's still possible to overwater. And so the state did not include that as part of their water conservation plan for the state, those daily water fees. Instead, they recommended things like don't water during the middle of the day, during the heat of the day, when there's a lot of evaporation that occurs. That's probably the biggest thing that they recommended as far as outdoor irrigation goes. Of course, most of the state is on metered systems. There's just only a limited number of us that have the blessing of being able to have a pressurized irrigation system.
I wasn't aware of that. I thought most PI systems were running meters.
No, most cities don't have PI
So
systems.
they're
What I
using
mean.
clearing water.
Yeah, they're using the drinking water on their traps. So, for example, Orem City uses just has one water system. So when I lived in Orem, I watched that water bill, and if I got a high one, I thought, ooh, I better adjust, and I did so. And so we've seen some of the cities in the north end of Utah County have similar problems with high usage. Spanish Fork City, when they put in their pressurized irrigation system, they installed meters from the get-go. And their usage is pretty much in line with the cities that use drinking water for irrigation as well. So that's a long answer to your question.
What's Orem's average GPM during the summer?
Well, for outdoor use, it's going to be about the 6 gallons per minute per acre. Yeah, that's just pretty much what we see at the Townhall Central.
Because the people are paying attention because they're paying the water.
Exactly.
Great, are there any other questions for Richard? I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Paul mentioned about redundancy. When the city built the Concord well, it was for that very purpose, to give us a redundant source for culinary, but also to supply the pressurized irrigation system. And what we have found in the last few years is that we have consumed the redundancy portion. In other words, we need that well. All summer long, we need that well. So that's what puts us in a predicament. And I recently spoke with the city engineer of American Fork. They went to a pressurized irrigation system a few years ago, which Richard's team worked on that as well. And I asked him how they were doing on their water system, and particularly with their pressurized irrigation. And he said, oh, we're on target to increase consumption, and we will max out, or not max out the system, but top our all-time use again. However, because we just recently switched over to a pressurized irrigation system, we have extra capacity remaining in culinary right now. So we take culinary and we dump it to the PI system. So they're using culinary wells right now to augment their pressurized irrigation consumption. And he said, over time, as a city, we're looking out a few years, a dozen years or so, and we can see the day coming where we consume that redundancy, and we're going to be back in the position of, hey, how do we get consumption under control? Because they do not meet in American Fork.
I'm confused. How have we used up our redundancy? Because our building boom happened before Cottonwood Well.
The redundancy is just because the demand on the pressurized irrigation system is so high that we depend on the Cottonwood well to supply that flow on a consistent basis. It's it doesn't act as a redundant system. So if we had either the Cottonwood well or the Harvey well have an issue and not operate, we will have to take the other well and put it into the culinary system. So that doesn't leave any capacity for the pressurized irrigation system.
I guess I'm still not understanding, because it would make sense if we had 300 more homes built. So what is using all that extra water?
Jeff, I'll let Jeff, I know where you're headed, Jeff, so I can answer.
I just said, we just had a transfer of 100+ homes because of the Manila water user system was abandoned, and we absorbed that into the Cedar Hills water system. And there's a lot of older, larger lots that are significantly more water being used there than a typical lot. And I think that had a big impact on us in this last year and a half. It's noticeable.
And so those Manila, those homes that were hooked up to the Manila Water Company system, then they switched back over to the Cedar Hills culinary system. And because our rates were not the same as the Manila Water Company rates, who were using culinary water both indoor and outdoor, then they also wanted to switch to our pressurized irrigation system as well. So they hooked up to both of our systems, culinary and irrigation. And like Jeff said, they were larger lots in that area. So that was a big supply.
They're paying more than the basic rate. They're paying a higher rate, right?
Yeah, well, there's the rate for the culinary water that's consumed based on the fact that they have access to pressurized irrigation.
But I mean, they're paying the bigger lot rate.
Right, yeah, it's based on the lot size. What I got on that. So I wanted to touch base on that, and then also just to reiterate that as you look at the model, and Richard did a great job. Him and his team really, I think, dove in and really spent the time to understand the system very well. But we pump every gallon that we consume in this pressurized irrigation system. So because we live on the bench and we have a lot of benefits from being in this part of the valley, but a disadvantage is we have to pump all the water up on the hill in order to provide those pressures. And then it all comes back down through the system. And so we have to pump every gallon, which means we have a power bill. And power doesn't get cheaper every year, it gets more expensive every year. And so, that's another reason that, another thing we need to consider. So based on the model that we looked at, there's several scenarios that aren't real rosy, and some scenarios that aren't even sustainable. And so without implementing some conservation measures, we could find ourselves in trouble. We could find ourselves in a pickle. And that's why the Water Conservation Committee was formed and met, is how can we as a community get a handle on our conservation efforts. And I wanted to discuss just a little bit about measures that the city is taking to consume water, or to conserve water. We installed about 12 rain delays at our city parks, and we installed those rain delays at the major parks. And so there are certain areas, certain systems that it's difficult to put a rain delay on. So where we have a strip of grass along the edge of a road, like in the planter strip, and it's a small system, sometimes those have just a hand dial clock, and it's in a green box in the ground. So it's not hooked up to a regular timer, a clock like you would have in a garage. It literally is just a little dial timer. Those are hard to install rain delays apparatuses on. And so we have several little strips that are not hooked up to a rain delay. They're very small. But we have had calls in a rainstorm where residents have said, hey, I'm looking at the strip right there by Walmart, in between, on Cedar Hills Drive. Well, we don't have a timer, we don't have a clock like we do at the major parks to put a rain delay device on. So we will still be exploring that. Yeah.
I do have a question about that specific thing with those strips. I know they're small, but when I drive through there, even on a sunny day, it seems to me like you're watering the entire street. Like, I know it's small, but can there be a way to turn the pressure down and not water 5 feet out into the street? The water just seems to
go everywhere.
You rolling down the street and it looks to me like it's a waste, but
That's a very good point. Thank you.
I found,
Sorry.
go ahead. Well, I noticed along Bay Hill the other day by the soccer field where they do sidewalk. There's a fairly narrow strip of grass there. There's sprinklers on both sides, spraying toward each other, and, you know, pretty close together. It looked to me like putting a lot of water down. Is anything done to measure how much water is actually being put down to establish how long sprinkler cycle?
This zone needs to go. Oh, Jeff, go ahead.
And to address that specific area, those sprinklers belong to the LDS church property there. And
Let's get after them.
well, and we've notified, we're in the process of requesting that these larger users, the schools, churches, et cetera, do a similar rain delay program that the cities.
It just seemed like an awful lot of sprinklers.
They do have a lot of heads right on that one little strip
I
there.
bet half of them could be taken out and there's still more.
And so, I mean, the city has areas that we can definitely take a closer look at, and we appreciate. And when they are here, a couple days in the week, they will run through the system. And so sometimes during the day, when that company comes, they'll turn on the system and let it run so that they can see how it operates, they can maintain heads, they can look at those kinds of things. And so we've had residents who've said, hey, I drove past this cart and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you guys have the water. You told us not to water today, but yet you are. And a lot of times that's when our maintenance guy is out there checking the system. And he needs to do that in the daytime when he can see the system. And he comes from out of town as well, so he does it on the days he's here. In addition to that, we've had low pressures in some of our zones, especially earlier this year. We've been adjusting our system as the year has gone on to get better pressures, especially in the lower zone. But in order to alleviate those big pressure drops, then we have tried to operate our large water meters like the parks at off-peak times from the residents. In other words, we would like to have the residents have as much pressure as possible for their yards. So we've been trying to operate our parks outside of peak time of the residents, just to give them more pressure, just to give the residents more pressure. So a few other things that we've been doing. We're about a year ago, we started to track specifically water consumption with a series of meters. Until then, we did not have a good gauge of how much water went through our system. So we've been installing master meters at certain locations. So in the model, the pond going, or the pipe system going from pond 10 up to pond 12, we have a meter there. We have a meter as it goes from there up to the upper tank. We have a meter at the golf course. Obviously the water coming from the CUP line, that's metered. They know every gallon, every microgallon that they send us. So we're starting to be able to gauge and see how much water we're using so that we can be more effective as a city and we can report to the community. And so that's one thing that we did was start the water on there. Yeah.
so are you saying that in the past we didn't know how much water we were using?
Yeah, without those meters, we didn't know exactly how many gallons were going through the system. We had an estimation based on a pump pumping at a certain gallons per minute for so many hours. We could estimate that. Now we actually have installed the meters in the lines, but it's just in the main lines. So it's in those large diameter pipes. Now, those meters are very expensive. Large meters are exponentially more expensive than a small meter. But that's how we were able to start reporting to the community how much water we're using as a whole. Now, we don't know exactly how many gallons go to this neighborhood or to that neighborhood. We just know in general this is how much water gets consumed.
So we don't really have a history of, we've got these meters, but there's no history to look back on.
We have a 2013 history, and then now we have the 2014 history. So that's all we're working on.
Are your ponds lined?
Yes, the ponds have a PVC liner in them, and so, and that's another thing, we try to keep people out of the ponds because those liners can be damaged if they step on them, punch a rock through them, or things like that, so. When we built the ponds, we did an evaluation, whether to do a clay liner or a membrane, and it came back that we would have a lot less water loss if we did the membrane, so that's what was done. I think it was very beneficial to see the water model performed by Hansen, and Luce, and that gives us a really good gauge, a really good feel of how our system is operating. And it's matching up with what we're seeing on the meters. It's matching up with the consumption that we're noticing in the meters versus what the pressures are doing in the system. We have sent out parliament reminders, messages, emails throughout the community. The Water Conservation Committee was formed and met and gave recommendations to the City Council on what we can do. And part of that was an education campaign. And so we've really been trying to communicate with the community. How many of you have seen a communication come from the city regarding water?
Aside from what comes in the weekly news, a monthly newsletter, not much.
Not much. Have you seen the signs out on the road, the waterometers, the dials?
Yeah, but you couldn't read them because they all oriented the other way.
You got to drive around that roundabout a few times.
Well, you put your soccer signs in the middle of the circle so you can see them as oncoming traffic. But you put the ones that is important, you put them there facing the other way and you can't see them without being a stop or being a traffic hazard.
Yeah, good point. We also
I don't want to be negative.
right. No, I don't take it that way. I appreciate those comments because we definitely want to help you understand, this information. So I don't know if you.
Most people don't, because you see what our level of participation is here tonight. 4 of us that are not employees of the city,
Yeah.
or on some committee of the city. I'm sorry, but, the message isn't getting out.
And so we're gonna, from the city side, we want to try harder. We want to communicate with the community and help them understand. And I wish there were more people here tonight. So we have the newsletter articles, like you mentioned, Facebook. And I know your heart rate crashed, so maybe you're not on Facebook lately, but
I've never used it.
we've been trying social media. We recently did a survey to find out how citizens would like us to communicate, and the number one choice for them was email. And so we would like residents to give us their email addresses so that we can give them this information if that's their preference for communication. So if we don't have yours, Marshall,
You've had mine for 3 years.
There's been a media campaign. There was an article in the Daily Herald, and then also Fox 13 did a small interview. Richard was interviewed. I got interviewed that day, and I thought it was positive that the news organizations picked up on that and know that we're trying to conserve. The bottom line is we have to conserve some way. And the Water Conservation Committee had a very good point. Look, we have to educate our residents. And as a city, we have to do better as well. And so that's why we're taking measures that we can to conserve.
We also know that letter has at that website.
That's true. We have a website called chwater.org, and that is on the waterometer at the very bottom. So there's information on that website. We also had an individual flyer that went out with the newsletter. And so that also.
Is these information you're referring to on different sites, does it give information such as how much water a resident should be putting on lawn for a given watering cycle?
Yes.
Most of it, a lot of us I know have different types of sprinkler systems depending on how large the area is. And I don't know how much water I'm putting down. I cut
If you go to a website called slowtheflow.org, slowtheflow.org,
Slow the flow.
you can schedule a free visit from Utah State, and they will come and put little cups all over your lawn and measure exactly how much water you're using and give you recommendations on what you should do to fix it.
Have we advertised that in the community the first time I've heard about it?
Many times, and that is on our website and on chwater.org. Yeah.
Well, regardless of what Marshall said, I think the city has done an excellent job in trying to communicate to the residents about water issues, and right along their toolbar on their Cedar Hills website is water conservation is one of the main. You don't have to go hunt down at the bottom, some little spot, it's right up there. It's actually the same site as chwater.org also. And on that site, there's a lot of information about slowtheflow.org and a lot of information on there of how to use water in a more judicious way. So I think, and I'm on the water committee, so, you know, I've made a concentrated effort this year to try to learn a little bit more about that and to be more judicious in my water usage, but it's very difficult. You know, it's very difficult to keep a really good green lawn. I don't know how you do it at the recommended levels, but I think even if we went to metering and we reduced the six gallons, I think that we would have to learn how to do that. And so I think the city has excellent resources available for us to teach us how to do this, along with this, putting all these cups around and all these kinds of things. So.
Well, obviously, I'm not on the water committee. and, you know, and I have to confess, one of the things I don't go surfing for is, you know, the city website stuff. I have other devices in my life. But I think there needs to be more of an information outpouring from the city to help us know where these resources are, or to know that they exist.
Let me just ask you a question. If, and understanding that you don't surf the city's website and get on Facebook, where would be the key point of contact that you would say, hey, the city's trying to reach out to me? Well, the email?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious if we were to contact you or attempt to communicate with you this information.
I don't know the face thingy.
The face thing you know good. Yes.
So I'm here because I want to learn. I saw those meters and those numbers, and throughout my life, when I see numbers that disparate, something's really wrong. Like, I have images of kids playing in the fire hydrant in the street all over the city, and people dancing around their lawns with their hoses on, and I don't see any kind of waste going on myself. I'm just wondering, what's the biggest thing that, is there one thing that if everybody did that, it would, you know, the biggest percentage that would conserve? Is there something? All I'm hearing is use less water, and then here's a website, go study all these things. I've done the cup thing in years past. I follow the 3 days a week, whatever, all that. So I think I'm doing okay, but I don't think my neighbors are. When I see that dial put over here, I'm like, who the heck's spraying water all over the place and using all that water? I don't get it.
I think one major problem that the average resident has is that their sprinkler systems do not provide uniform coverage. And so what happens is they may have one area of their yard that has, you know, overlapped 3 or 4 times by sprinklers, and another area that only has single coverage. And so when they see that dry spot show up with the single coverage area, they adjust their timer to make sure that that stays green. And so the rest of their yards may be getting 2 or 3 times the amount they should have, just to keep that one spot green. Whereas if people would say, okay, I know I've got a couple of dry spots where I don't get good coverage, as those show up, rather than change my dial, I'm going to pull out my hose and green those up that way. It's a much more efficient.
Make sure your hose is hooked to the pressurized irrigation.
Yeah.
I learned the hard way. Hooking it up to my wife was watering, and our water bill doubled or whatever. So
I can always tell when my grandkids come to visit me, 'cause the bar goes way up.
We've been in our home 8 years, I guess, and I've had problems with ground spots. This year, I finally went around, I realized a lot of the pop-ups are not, the turf is filled up enough. And so I did a lot of sprinkler replacement, extensions and stuff. We were going out of town, and it seems to have solved that, but I still don't know. I mean, I'll do this slow the flow thing, because I think I need that information. I need to know how much water I'm putting down.
that was really good for us because we have pretty thick clay where our lot is, and they were able to tell us to not just water in one big expanse, but to water for 5 minutes and then let it sit, and then 20 minutes later water for another, that type of a thing, so the water had a chance to soak down it, otherwise it would just run off. And so that's what we do, and it made a big difference.
Where the gravel pit, the water just
Just disappears.
So, the city staff knows that I'm one of 10 homes that has a meter, experimental meters this year. And as we've been working through some of the issues on my meter, it's just been the most frustrating water summer of my life. And so I'm ready to throw in the towel, and we're gonna zero-scape we're on a hill lot, and so we have 3 tiers, and we're gonna zero-scape our whole last upper tier. So I'm wondering, could the city or the state, is there a state incentive program, or have you guys talked about possible city incentive programs for zero-scaping portions of yards? Because living in a desert, at some point, that really is the best option.
Well, do you want to talk about that? I know Conservation Committee can talk about that.
I couldn't quite hear her question.
So her question is there any incentive, either from the city or from the state, to convert, say, to some zero-scape, or if you were to lower your water consumption?
I know that the Central Utah Water Conservancy District does have some programs available. I'm not exactly sure what they are. We're not like Las Vegas where they're paying you to take up sod or anything like that. But Central Utah Water Conservancy District does have a program. And I'm not exactly sure what the extent of that is.
So what I did was I went and bought a new sprinkler timer that has its own weather station that will measure precipitation, keep track of the temperature, all of those things, and then adjust how long it runs based on those factors. Because I'm one of the lots that has a meter too, the city said, well, don't alter, what you do this year because you've got a meter, and so I haven't hooked it up yet. But I'm planning to apply for a $100 rebate on that timer through the Central Utah Water Conservancy District.
How much was the timer?
It was $200.
So we actually didn't mention that to everybody initially, but so we do have a few homes where we installed pressurized irrigation meters, and we asked the users to just use your system as you did last year. Don't be concerned about your water use or getting dinged or fined or paying extra money this year. We just want to see what your consumption. We want to see if you're surprised at your consumption. And we're actually not letting people know until later what their consumption was, so that they don't get nervous or modify their habits or the way they use their system.
So with power consumption right now, in smart grids, there's a big move towards smart meters where you can see in real time how much power you're using in your home. And they even give you feedback as to how expensive the power is. And so if the power company charges less for power at nighttime, you can change and they move washing clothes and running dishwashers tonight, and it's cheaper because they have a little meter to tell you exactly what's going on. I'm wondering if there's been any progress in making smart water meters as well, where you have a real-time meter in your house telling
there are systems with radio read meters that then you can, like, get on the water utilities website, in this case it would be the city's website, and see what your water usage is. I don't know if it's actual real time, but within a short time period, so you can kind of track that and monitor it. They're expensive though.
And we are moving that direction as a city for the culinary side, so that we can help people identify leaks or, you know, high water usage, things like that. But on the culinary side, we do have a metered system, and it is, you know, a radio read style system where it reports to a kind of a tower. And so our intent is to migrate the system over to that kind of a smart system for the culinary, because we have a metered system there. Yeah.
Oh, Trent, go ahead. Oh, go on.
I appreciate that, right now, we obviously need to conserve water, but financially, is what we're paying, we have a flat rate now for a PI system. Financially, is that doing what it's supposed to do? And then, my follow-up to that would be, if we go to a metered system, do I still pay about the same? Because right now, I know what I'm paying, and I know what I'm getting. I don't want the meter system to be purely punitive. It should be also just financially viable.
That's right. So to your first question, are the revenues that we're receiving from the PI rates maintaining our expense to the system? And yes, we're very close on that. You know, our power bills, we have noticed, are increasing, so we have had to increase the utility fund for that, to pay for that extra power. But they're within reason. The goal, and again, tonight's meeting isn't necessarily pro or against any type of specific conservation measure. The Water Conservation Committee did discuss metering and was saying, hey, we have to make sure if that were an option that this council considered, that it would need to be about where everybody is now. There would obviously be some users who would say, I don't care what the cost is, I'm turning it on. There would be others who would say, hey, I didn't know, and I'm gonna cut back. So potentially they might pay less. So it would balance out.
Do you have the flexibility of running your pumps on off-peak times?
Right now we're running pumps off peak and on peak and 24/7, yeah. Yeah. What happens, as you saw in the model, when those peak demand times happen, the tanks actually start to drop. And our tanks act as a shock absorber in the system. So the tanks, you know, go down and basically get to very low levels. And then we make it through, and then during the daytime, pumps keep pumping, and we start filling those tanks back up. But then as soon as we get about full, some of the pumps may turn off for a short period, but as soon as there's a drawdown in the tank, 3-4 feet, our SCADA system, which is an automatic computer-aided system, turns those pumps back on, so that we're feeding the system as the tank is actually drawing down. So the pumps don't have a big rest. Did somebody else have?
You know, I was going to say, one of the things you can do, I know slow to flow is a lot more accurate, but one thing you can do is actually take a tuna fish can and put out in your yard, and you can actually get a rough measurement of how much water you're putting on your yard doing that. And I believe it says 1 inch per 3 days in water, half inch per water in 3 days. So you can actually get a pretty good idea just doing kind of your own little self-home test. And we've done that a few times too.
I think if you call for a test from Slow to Flow from the Utah State Extension Service and see it done once, you literally can do it yourself and show your neighbors how to do it. So, very handy. Any other questions? So, that's what we had for tonight. I've spoken with Richard about having his official study presented at City Council.
So that will be on a future council agenda. And you're welcome to get that information as well. And what I would like to do is take a copy of these slides and put them on our website as well, so that people, if people want to watch the video that we recorded tonight's meeting, and we'll post that as well. And then you probably can't see the slides from that video, so we'll put those on the website. So, anybody else have any questions?
I apologize for being late. I had to pick up something for my work, and so if this has been covered, I apologize. The thing I've been very curious about is as part of this study, it seems prudent and wise, and I understand that Councilman Crawley actually suggested it, but it didn't get very far, and that is to have implemented the alternate watering days to see how that could help us bring down the water usage, because it becomes education and it becomes implementation, and hence it's been successful in Alpine and other cities in helping bring down water usage. And I was wondering why I'm wondering if that will be reconsidered as part of this overall consideration prior to voting on any sort of a bond.
Yeah, we did cover that earlier. So, but Richard, do you want to maybe just reiterate what you previously?
Well, first of all, the study we did really was not intended to look at various options for achieving water conservation. Rather, it was simply an evaluation of the capacity of the system under various levels of operation. And so we did not address that in our study. It wasn't part of our scope.
So you weren't asked to do that. So I guess is it inappropriate to ask you as the city manager about why that, and if it will be considered as part of an overall part of the thinking process, because we're talking about a lot of money, and frankly, as a former city council, it doesn't make any sense to me that wouldn't have been part of the process in trying to make an intelligent decision on water use, whether we should have meters or not, et cetera.
Yeah, the studies are inconclusive on if going to an odd even watering day actually does provide any benefit. I've actually talked to Alpine City. You referenced Alpine City. I've talked to those guys. I called many other communities that have that kind of restriction. They're not seeing dramatic changes in total consumption. And so
Are they seeing a lowering of consumption?
minimal.
But they are seeing a lowering of consumption.
And
Not significant, it's all possible.
But it depends on the city too.
yeah,
It depends on what your definition of significant is.
Didn't he say that the state did some kind of study and the usages actually went up?
The state of Utah, the Division of Water Resources, did a study in the early 2000s as they were developing the state water conservation plan, and they looked at systems that implemented like odd even water days or every third day, anyway, assigned watering days. And what they found is that the consumption actually increases.
Okay.
And so that's not part of the state water plan.
So as a
We also
follow-up,
have some real data on this, you gotta be aware.
okay,
Our city implemented even odd housing water restrictions in the past. And we know from our own experience in Cedar Hills that didn't work. Our consumption actually went up. We also have some data points from cities like Spanish Fork where they have meters installed and their usage is far lower than ours.
so allow me to offer the difference in the data point. And the difference is pretty obvious. If citizens knew that they're facing a $2 million bond versus voluntarily working within an approach that would help avert that kind of additional expense to their pocketbooks, I'd have to think it's pretty much a no-brainer when the citizens understand that and a real plan is implemented and tested. With that as, well, if we don't, we're going to have to consider this.
Well, if you'd been here earlier,
Yes.
that's what 99% of the conversation has been tonight.
Okay.
Has been on trying to implement those methods and things. I haven't heard hardly anything of, we need to put meters in and that's the only solution. We need to try education first and have our citizens understand what they can do and try and see what happens.
I've been here to other meetings, and I would assure you that there's very serious consideration about a $2 million implementation of meters.
I understand, I'm just telling you what you missed tonight,
I-
so that you understand.
Okay.
In my perception in one meeting, I'm not getting the same feeling that you're that you're kind of giving that feeling. I'm not-
Seriously,
I'm
Ken,
not
don't be
getting
so rude, walking in so late and just coming here so hostile.
I came here to get some answers.
Just don't be so rude.
that. You're not getting answers, you're saying your opinion.
Yeah, I don't think I'm being rude.
You are.
Asking questions is
I
rude.
don't know who you are, but you're being really rude, so.
Rude.
It sounds to me like you're being rude, let people know that. That's just my perception.
It's the propaganda.
My opinion.
It's the propaganda, thank you.
I appreciate everybody being here tonight, and so, again, so we'll have this information on our website, and again, thank you to the Water Conservation Committee. Thank you to Hansen and Luce for doing this, this study. Obviously, there's more conversation to be had, and, you know, the city council will be considering a lot of different options. Again, the goal is to keep our community beautiful, to keep our lawns and our yards, you know, where they need to be to keep the values of our community up. And so that's what we're working towards. So I appreciate everybody coming tonight.
Thank you.